this morning because I had been, juggling a bunch of different ideas, and I think I was watching some Jordan Peterson video, and I wasn't even thinking about this presentation tonight, and it reminded me of this question and open uh, a gap in the Austrian literature that was noted by um, Salerno in this article on hyperinflation and the destruction of human personality. Um, I hope you got a chance to look at those readings that I put in the chat. But let me just give like a quick overview of what Salerno says in that article. So he's looking at the psychological effects of hyperinflation. So he notes that like all of the economic effects of hyperinflation are well established. Like we know what happens when the money loses its value, and all of the economic effects. Like there's capital consumption, there's monetary replacement, and it's very chaotic and all of that. But what he was interested in this article was to just talk through some of the psychological effects, and he found a few sources that from the German hyperinflation experience of people who were talking about what it was like to live and work and try to survive in that sort of environment. So and he also like just sort of set the stage for an Austrian view of personality. And like the main quote here is on page 18. He says, "The central role of money and property in the formation of the individual human personality under the social division of labor has yet to be investigated in any depth and will not be attempted here." So I read that from Salerno and I'm thinking, okay, that's what he's saying is that there's this potential to go into depth on this topic. And ever since I've read that, I've been thinking about ways to approach this topic, ways to fill in that gap. So I want to, just walk through his conception of human personality that he has in that article, and then I want to make some connections to a Mises Wire article that I wrote a long time ago. It was back when Jordan Peterson was just becoming popular, and I had watched through his Maps of Meaning course, and what I had noticed by watching all the videos in that course and also flipping through his Maps of Meaning text is that there are a lot of similarities between Peterson's action framework and the Austrian praxeological one. It's based on ends and means. It's based on varying uncertainty. It's based on goal directed behavior and intention. And so in that Mises Wire article, I just sort of walked through some of the similarities and differences, and I came to the conclusion that the differences weren't like bad. It's not like Jordan Peterson was wrong if he was different from Mises. The differences were just based on the fact that he was doing psychology and not doing economics. So with that said, the stuff that I want to talk about tonight is not like a priori. It's not like we can't imagine a universe in which people like lived and acted in a different sort of way. So the sort of stuff that I'm going to discuss tonight is not universal. It's not a priori. It's not something that has that sort of epistemological foundation like a lot of the laws of economics do. So I don't have anything written down here. I just have like some bullet points here. Like I'm not working on a paper. I just have some ideas that I've been thinking about along these lines. So the two sources are that Salerno article on hyperinflation and the destruction of human personality, and then just my thoughts on Jordan Peterson's action framework in that Mises Wire article. And then the main springboard here was Salerno's idea that the sorry, somebody else's microphone is on, it's distracting me. I'm just going to turn the volume down. So the main idea here came from Salerno's article, where he said that there's this hole in the literature where nobody has gone into depth to talk about like an Austrian approach to human personality. Let me start with some basics here. So action is the use of means to attain ends. And what motivates action is dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs. So whenever we act, it means that we're currently dissatisfied with the way things are. And so when we act, we are transforming our environment. We're using the means around us and controlling it in a way so that we can achieve some sort of desired state of affairs. So when we're acting, we're trying to achieve this, we're trying to achieve a new universe, and the universe that we're trying to achieve is one in which it's better for us than the universe that we replaced it with, or actually more accurately, better than the universe that would have transpired if we didn't act in the first place. So there's some uncertainty about the future, but it's not so much that it prevents any attempt at action at all. So you can imagine that um, if we had too much uncertainty, then we wouldn't act at all. So like if we couldn't even guess what would happen as a result of our action, or have some sort of reasonable anticipation that our action would bring about the desired state of affairs, then we wouldn't act at all. So there has to be some level of understanding of cause and effect, and at least the possibility that your action will bring about that desired state of affairs. But as we know, there is no such thing as perfect foreknowledge. In fact, if we had perfect foreknowledge, then we wouldn't act either. We would just be, moving along with time. We wouldn't be acting. We might be behaving, we might be moving, but if we had perfect foreknowledge, then we couldn't really say that what our behavior is action in the economic sense. Another another thing that we know from both Mises and Rothbard and also Peterson is that ends are nested. So it means that we can articulate multiple goals for one action. We can have really small goals, but also some really large, like all-encompassing goals satisfied by the same action. And Peterson gives the example of setting the table. And so, like one goal you might have is to place the fork in the exact right position so that it's where it's supposed to be based on the etiquette of the culture that you're in. And so that's one goal that you have, is getting the fork in the right location. But another goal that you might have by doing that is to have a nice place to eat with your family that evening. And you might be doing that because you love your family and you want to be a good member of your family. And you might want to be a good member of your family for other reasons, like some overarching religious reasons and stuff like that. So so what it means is that whenever you're acting, you could articulate a bunch of different goals that go along with, or that you're trying to achieve with that same action. But it's important to remember that even though we can articulate a bunch of goals, what we're actually trying to achieve is one state of affairs. So we can't achieve multiple universes in our action. We can only achieve one state of affairs is actually attained in our action. And what that means is that state of affairs has multiple um, um, aspects to it, both intended and unintended aspects to it. So the things that we intend are that was the reason why we acted, or that when we act, we're trying to achieve that uh, those certain aspects of that state of affairs. But we know that there's going to be other things that we don't intend, or are irrelevant, or we know that like some things might happen that are like accidental, and those are also bound up in the same state of affairs that's achieved when we act. And a lot of Peterson's discussion in his course is about what can happen when those unintended things happen. Like what happens when you get in a car wreck on your way home, and how people can just sort of like spiral down into depression when they're frustrated like that. When they have this action, they have this desired state of affairs, and they don't achieve it, and so they start. If they have all of these hierarchically nested ends, the whole thing can come collapsing. Like so suppose you're setting the table and you mess it up. Like somebody who's like really neurotic, they might think, well, if I messed up setting the table, that means I'm just a bad person, because like one of the top level ends that you were trying to achieve by setting the table correctly is you just want to be a good person, be a good family member and that sort of thing. So a lot of what Peterson talks about is about how it's important um, to localize and think about the failures in the smallest possible way. So if you misplace the fork, then you should contain that error. You shouldn't let your whole worldview, your whole nested end structure collapse just because you had one failure. Anyway, I sort of talked too much about that. Um, another similarity between Peterson's action framework and that of Mises is that value and preference are inextricably linked to action. And you might be familiar, or you're probably familiar, there's a lot of smart people in this Discord server. You're probably familiar with the concept of demonstrated preference. Rothbard talks about this a lot in his article, Toward a Reconstruction of Utility and Welfare Economics. And the idea here is that we cannot think about preference except through action, and we cannot have action without preference. So somebody might say all day that they don't like smoking, that they're not a smoker, or they don't like cigarettes. But if at the end of the day you see them smoking a cigarette, they've demonstrated a preference for smoking. Their actual preference is what they do, it's not what they say. So I have a quick quote from Jordan Peterson here from his Maps of Meaning book. Action presupposes valuation, or its implicit or unconscious equivalent. To act is literally to manifest preference about one set of possibilities contrasted with an infinite set of alternatives. If we wish to live, we must act. Acting, we value. And then in his 12 Rules for Life, he's got a similar idea. Standards of better or worse are not illusory or unnecessary. If you hadn't decided what you were doing right now was better than the alternatives, so for you guys listening to this presentation on the Discord server, you wouldn't be doing it. The idea of a value-free choice is a contradiction in terms. Value judgments are a precondition for action. So what that means is value and action are inextricably linked. Finally, moving on to some of the points made by Salerno in his article, is that he makes this claim, or is at least considering human personality as a mode of being, not a collection of traits. So we're all familiar with a personality test. Like you take a test and you can see how you score on different traits, like agreeableness, neuroticism, or in the Myers-Briggs test, there's extroversion, introversion, and intuition, and perception, and blah blah blah, all that stuff. That is like the opposite of what Salerno is talking about when he talks about human personality. Here's a quote: human personality, as the term is used here, does not denote a cluster of psychological attributes and qualities. Rather, it is a mode of being and becoming based on economic calculation and the ownership of property. So the key idea here is that for Salerno, personality is a mode of being and becoming. It's like it's acting, it's existing in your environment, and specifically a social environment, to achieve the desired states of affairs that you want in a social nexus. So, like in the division of labor, that's what he's considering the human personality. And I would argue that that's actually closer to what the way we use the term personality just in casual conversation is closer to that conception of human personality than like the bundle of traits conception of human personality. So a good example of this is you might like have met somebody at a party or something like that, and later on you're talking about that person to somebody else, and you say that person, they just don't have a personality, like they just lack a personality. And when you say something like that, you're not really referring to like specific traits. Probably that person that you're talking about, they're just like aimless, they're listless, they it's not that they're happy or sad, it's not that they're extroverted or introverted. I mean, they might be a little socially awkward, but what you're mainly referring to is that they don't really have like a drive, they don't really have intention, or a lot of intention in the way that they're going about the way that they're living their life. So it's an absence of goal directed behavior. Not You're not referring to, or probably not referring to, specific traits. So I would argue that Salerno's definition of personality here is closest to the way like we just generally use the term, and it's not the way most psychologists would use the term personality. Obviously, Peterson would be an exception, but I would say he's an outlier among psychologists. I took when I was in college, I took a theories of personality class, and it was all about traits. It was all about like the big five personality tests, like agreeableness and neuroticism and extroversion, and I can't even remember all of them, but personality was like the bundle of traits that a person has, that could be measured. They had to have operational definitions. They had to be measurable based on taking tests and stuff like that. It was not what Salerno is talking about here, which is a mode of being and becoming. Okay, so excuse me. Let's talk about the two parts of that term. So there's human personality has two parts. There's the human part and the personality part, or the person part. So I want to talk a little bit about what this means. So the first thing I want to talk about is the human part. So what is it? What are some things that separate humans from animals? And this is where I looked into a little bit of neuroscience, not like cutting edge research or anything, but just like what's inside of the brain. And you might be aware that the prefrontal cortex, it's the section of the brain that's on the very front, like if you touch your forehead, that's the section of the brain that it refers to. And in humans, it's much larger than any other animal. The closest thing is the chimpanzee, and there's some other mammals that have prefrontal cortexes, and they can be bigger and smaller. But humans, by and large, have the largest and most developed prefrontal cortex. And what's interesting is sort of funny about neurological research is the way that they the way that they figure out what parts of the brain do is they see what happens to people when that part of the brain is damaged. So I remember this from my psychology classes in college. We talked about this guy that somehow he was working on the railroad, and a railroad spike went straight through his prefrontal cortex. It went straight through the front part of his brain, and he survived. But all of his friends, this is so interesting. All of his friends said he was like a totally different person. Like after the railroad spike went through his prefrontal cortex, he was a very grumpy and not easy. He wouldn't get along with people, so he was less social. He was yeah, he sort of like kept his distance from people. He wasn't as nice of a guy. And so, with that instance and a bunch of other where people have damaged their prefrontal cortex, these neuroscientists they've sort of figured out what the prefrontal cortex does. And here's what I found from this article by Miller, Friedman, and Wallace. So they say the ability to generalize behavior guiding principles and concepts from experience is key to intelligent, goal-directed behavior. It allows us to deal efficiently with a complex world and to adapt readily to novel situations. We review evidence that the prefrontal cortex, the cortical area that reaches its greatest elaboration in primates, and especially humans, plays a central part in acquiring and representing this information. And later on, they say the prefrontal cortex is an ideal place to look for neural correlates of abstract information. It occupies a far greater proportion of the human cerebral cortex than in other animals, suggesting that it might contribute to those cognitive capacities that distinguish humans from animals. That's an important point there. So, like, what distinguishes humans from animals is the developed prefrontal cortex and the cognitive abilities that come from that. On initial examination, prefrontal cortex damage has remarkably little overt effect. Patients can perceive and move. There is little impairment in their memory, and they can appear remarkably normal in casual conversation. However, despite the superficial appearance of normality, prefrontal cortex damage seems to devastate a person's life. They have difficulty in sustaining attention, in keeping on task, and seem to act on whims and impulses without regard to future consequences. This pattern of high level deficits, coupled with a sparing of lower level basic functions, has been called a dysexecutive syndrome and goal neglect. And they cite two other studies that came up with those terms: dysexecutive syndrome and goal neglect. So I'm thinking this is exactly right. So if one of the things that distinguishes humans from animals is this fully developed or more fully developed prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is all about goals and being able to think abstractly, and being able to plan and think in the long term, then this is exactly what Salerno is talking about when he's talking about human personality. And another bit of evidence that I thought about today when I was putting this together is the creation narrative in Genesis also ascribes action and control and authority or dominion to humans, like at after creation. So the first thing that God does is he creates humans, and then he bestows on them dominion over his creation. This is Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Um, and then in verse 28, and God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So, so here, like, and you don't have to be like a Christian to at least see that this is probably referring to something that's like at least like primordially true for humans. Um, but the point here is that something that's integrally a part of being a human is having dominion and having control over the resources around you, over creation. In chapter 2, there's a sort of like a replaying of the creation narrative, and it says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." So, living creature, that's like the same thing as all of the animals. And then just a few verses later, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Then the Lord God said, It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him." And that's when he creates Eve. So there's two things that I want to say. So what this says is that first God creates man, and he's just like a living creature. So not much different, maybe a little bit more advanced, maybe some extra language faculties compared to the animals. But then God says it's not good that the man is alone, and so he creates another person. So what I'm thinking here is that this connects to Salerno's idea of human personality as being inextricably connected to the social division of labor. So like we are not meant to be in isolation. And I have a few other like non-biblically based pieces of evidence later on to talk about this. But the point here is that like we are made to be in community. We're supposed to have other people around us. And it wasn't until um, after Adam and Eve were put together in the garden that the man said, "This at last is one of my bones." So it's like it sort of points to like a completion of it. So like before I was incomplete, before I wasn't fully developed, I was just a creature like all the animals, and now I'm a true man because I have this helpmate with me. Okay, so moving on here. Um, so the other part of that term, so there's human, and we've talked about what it means to be human. The other part of that term is person, and this is actually quite timely since we just had the Roe versus Wade was struck down today, and that's we see that this question of what is a person is huge for our culture and like a lot of these like big questions like abortion and euthanasia, environmental care, slavery, all of these things hinge on who or what counts as a person. So if you just look online, it says a person is a human being regarded as an individual. And I think when we use it just in casual language, we usually are referring to some level of cognitive ability and also legal and ethical protections and requirements. So when we say somebody's a person, uh, uh, we're sort of distinguishing that from animals, basically, like in like an ethical sort of sense. So like animals don't have an obligation to uphold their end of contract, mainly because they can't even enter into contracts. But animals don't have the same sorts of rights that human persons do. So whenever we use the term person, usually what we're referring to there is like some like responsibility, obligation, some sort of ethical uh, nature to this being. Um, so where was I? Yeah. So personality must refer to the playing out of personhood. So, and we've established that that has something to do with cognitive ability and legal and ethical distinction. And we've established that the cognitive ability refers to planning and goal directed behavior, the ability to act with regard to future consequences, or the ability to act with like an intentionally, like intentionally trying to transform the world in a way that we see fit. And another point is that the legal and ethical distinction can only exist when humans are in a social environment. So going back to Genesis 2, like first man was created, Adam was created, but he was all alone, sort of like Crusoe on his island. But we only have like ethics, we only have like this legal distinction of what a person is when we have multiple persons, because then they can harm each other, they can make contracts with each other, they can exchange with each other. That's when we have all of the ethical considerations come into play. Okay, so finally, human personality is best thought of as a mode of being, acting, and becoming within a social division of labor. Uh, so man acts is not only the starting point for praxeology, but it also describes the nature of human personality. Action is what it means to be human. Action is economizing behavior, and in a social context, that means a division of labor in which our skills and aptitudes are economized across persons. So when we participate in a division of labor, we subject our will to the preferences of others by producing what other people want. And the indirect goal, obviously, is we want to attain our own desired state of affairs. Like when I go work, when I'm teaching economics classes at Bryan College, um, when I do that, I'm doing that because I want to get the paycheck so that I can provide for my family and we can go on trips and I can feed my kids and all that sort of stuff. So like I'm indirectly trying to achieve my own state of affairs, but in order for me to do that, I have to help other people achieve their desired state of affairs, namely help them learn something about economics or help them get a degree so that they can go on and get a better job or something like that. So the point that I'm trying to make is being a human person in a social division of labor involves fitting myself into that nexus, into what everybody else is doing and what everybody else wants. And Salerno talks about that a lot in his Destruction of the Human Personality article. He talks about how when when the ability to engage in economic calculation goes away, like in a hyperinflation episode, it means that we fail to insert ourselves into the division of labor in a way that like makes sense. Like we have to take on different jobs than before. We have to we consume capital, which means the entire structure of production is messed up, and so everybody changes like their jobs. They change the way they had been participating and adding to society, and so it just caused a bunch of chaos and also just like psychological turmoil. It's worth pointing out that participating in a division of labor requires complex planning. So going back to the prefrontal cortex here, the only reason we can participate in a social division of labor like this is if we can like think a few steps ahead. So it's a very indirect process of attaining our own goals by first helping other people attain their goals, and then we get what we want. That's like that takes a few steps, and I'm not sure if like any there are any examples of that in the animal kingdom. I mean, you could talk about like a hive of bees, but I don't think that they're actually thinking about. In fact, I know because they don't have a prefrontal cortex. They're not thinking about how their job is helping them get what they want. So like they're just sort of like born with these instincts, and so they do those sorts of things. A lot of times we like to like refer to an ant colony or a hive of bees as having a division of labor, but they really don't in like the human sense because They don't have the planning. They don't have the thinking ahead of the multiple steps. So it's very indirect, especially if we have like a really long structured production, because what that means is your plans, you have to subject your will to somebody else who has like this really long-term plan that requires the coordinated efforts of a bunch of other people that have their own wills that need to be subjected in the social division of labor. So it's like the point I'm trying to make is it's really complex and it's not doable unless we have market prices, unless we have money and a private property order in which people can exchange their labor for a market price and exchange their capital goods for a market price. That that whole project would be impossible. But like constructing a structure of production where everybody's skills and aptitudes are used in the most economizing way to achieve and attain all the different goods and services that we want and need as an outcome, that would just be, it's just impossible. And of course, you all know that from the economic calculation debate over socialism. But Salerno's point was that it destroyed the personality of the people who were in that division of labor in the 1920s Germany. So here's just a few quotes from Salerno's articles. So he found a couple of authors that talked about the way people felt during the hyperinflations, and he says a cynical frivolity penetrated men's souls. No one knew what he possessed, and some men wondered what they really were. Man, that just sounds absolutely terrible. But this confusion belongs to inflation, is inseparably connected with it, and was one of the reasons why the people gave up thinking things out. It all seemed just madness, and it made the people mad. So like there's this, we just lose the ability to think things out, to use our prefrontal cortex to make the long-term plans and think abstractly and to consider different options and how they might play out in the future. Let's do one more here. Saving is the very source of wealth and health of a sound nation, but we have no longer a sound nation. We are on our way to become a crazy, a neurotic, a mad nation. It was a sad world, a world in which none was better than the other, and all was a matter of chance and degree. A sad world and a sad conception for a girl who still remembered the good old times of grandmother. Our times made us cynical. So there's a total breakdown of human personality because of the hyperinflation. People were not able to act. They were not able to get control of the means that they needed to attain a certain state of affairs. They were not able to plan for any sort of long-term time horizon. They were not able to fit themselves into a social division of labor. And so basically, like, they weren't able to be human persons. They weren't able to be human because of the hyperinflation, which is, it's just a crazy thing to think about. Like, we think about all the economic effects, but we don't think about those sorts of like personality and psychological effects. Okay, so lastly here, I just want to list out a few other cases, a few other places where people lose that ability to be a person. Where do we separate humans from personality? Where do we separate humans from the ability to act and participate in a division of labor? And so obviously Salerno talks about the hyperinflation episode, but there's cases of feral children, people stranded on an island. Socialism obviously is another example. We could think about people who are in solitary confinement and like the psychological turmoil that happens when somebody's in solitary confinement. And like a really sad case is people who have learned helplessness from physical and emotional abuse. And the idea here is that like somebody who is like, they've been basically imprisoned and they're not able to do the things that they want to do because they've just been beat down by somebody else. They sort of like lose the ability to be a person. They lose the ability to use means to attain ends. And some less true areas, but are sort of approximations of what I'm talking about. We could think about astronauts being in the space station, or like when they're preparing for isolation and confinement in space. There's also the case of culture shock and homesickness. So if you've ever traveled internationally for an extended period of time, like there's this honeymoon phase where you like love the new place that you're visiting, but then like you have this sort of like depression. You have this like it's sort of hard to describe. It's like um, it's homesickness, but it's also like what am I doing here? How do I fit in? Like I can't converse with people. I can't like fit into like a division of labor here. Everything is so different, and I'm not used to their norms. I'm not used to doing the things that they're doing, and so it's hard for me to be a person in this sort of a situation. Another huge case is the COVID lockdowns. So like I mean that's just like that's not even an approximation where people were like literally they were just shut off from their ability to do their job. They were shut off from their ability to participate in a division of labor. And I definitely don't think that it's a coincidence that we had those COVID lockdowns, and then you remember in the summer of 2020, there were all of the George Floyd riots everywhere. And I really do think that the lockdowns exacerbated that. So the reason we saw all the violence and the burning and the destruction, I think it was people lashing out because of the psychological effects of being locked down. So like people being prevented from being persons, to use Salerno's conception of human personality. So if we shut off their ability to act within a social division of labor, then there's all of the psychological turmoil that results from that. And then you have the spark, the killing of George Floyd that sort of started an explosion, basically, sometimes literally. Okay, another example is entrepreneurs in the bust phase of the business cycle. And if there's another Salerno article, it's a great one, it's a famous one called "A Reformulation of Austrian Business Cycle Theory in Light of the Financial Crisis." And here he talks about the secondary deflation, which is actually a bad term because it's not necessarily tied to a decrease in the money supply, but he ascribes that to the quote pervasive malaise and waning of quote within quote animal spirits among the massive entrepreneurs that occur when the recession reveals their cluster of miscalculations and errors and saps their confidence in their ability to identify and calculate profitable investments. I argue that the secondary deflation is not the result of an incidental monetary contraction that depresses some arbitrary price level. Rather, it is a reaction to and correction of a relative price distortion caused by the extreme overbidding of factor and asset prices during the euphoria of the boom. So, and later on he says, when stunted by quantitative easing and fiscal deficits driven by stimulus programs, the entrepreneurial malaise becomes chronic and economic stagnation ensues. So, like, there's this, we had the boom period of the business cycle where factory prices are bid up to like astronomically, and then we had the bust phase where we had this correction. And one of the effects of the bust, or one of the what am I trying to say? One of the indirect effects of the bust is entrepreneurial malaise. So, and that's like he means that in a purely psychological sense. Like they just lose their ability to make accurate forecasts, lose their ability to take on risks, to jump in and do the things that they need to do to be entrepreneurs. And the reason why is because economic calculation was falsified during the artificial boom phase of the business cycle. That was another example that I thought of people losing their ability to be persons, and also psychological effects because of a lack of economic calculation or a shutdown of the division of labor, or otherwise just preventing people from acting. Uh, there's also like addiction and like kids and teenagers glued to their phones and social media. And there's like all of like tons and tons of research showing that there's really bad psychological effects of this. So this is sort of willful, or like you can consider somebody who willfully, or like in the process of making their own voluntary choices, they become addicted to a substance, and how it just destroys their personality, and they withdraw from the division of labor, and like they can only think about one sort of thing. It's another example of uh, people losing their ability to think long term. and also just losing the ability to think short term, to just be able to converse with somebody. If like somebody is totally addicted to their cell phone, a lot of kids these days, they're just unable to communicate clearly with somebody else, and when somebody asks them a question, they just sort of freeze. And I think that's because they haven't learned how to fit into a social environment. That one's not as like economic as the hyperinflation or socialism or the bust phase of the business cycle, but it's the same idea. Okay, so my point here is that these conditions and the corresponding negative outcomes, they all involve a separation of the human and the personality, as defined as the ability to act within a social division of labor to bring about a desired state of affairs. So these are all just some like initial thoughts that I've had. It might turn into a paper. I might present this at some point, but these are just some initial thoughts I had based on that quote from Salerno's article, where he said that this conception of human personality has yet to be investigated in any depth, and so I thought I would start thinking about it, maybe turn it into something. So in conclusion, we should consider the non-economic parts of the human condition as well as the economic. The devastating consequences of hyperinflation and socialism extend to the human spirit. Conversely, human flourishing can be considered along economic and psychological or spiritual grounds. Unhampered markets not only provide for material needs, but also allow individuals to be and become fulfilled persons. So thanks, and I'll try to answer any questions you have.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. First question we have for you here comes from Komodo Dragon, and I'm gonna rephrase his question a little bit. He asked, "How did you become so based in Red Pill?" I'll rephrase that into, how did you get interested into Austrian economics and enter into this larger world? How does someone become the assistant professor of economics at Bryan College?
So it all started with the Ron Paul 2008 campaign, where I saw him on the debate stage, and he was saying stuff that was different from the other ones. And my first reaction to him was like, "Oh, what a weirdo! Like, what a crackpot! He's saying a bunch of different stuff." But then when I went to his website, I looked at his like policy stances, and they all seemed to be like consistent with each other. And I wasn't really getting that from at least the first debate performance that I saw. Anyway, so I read his book, and it all made sense to me. The book was The Revolution by Ron Paul, and at the back of the Revolution, he had some recommended reading, and one of the recommended readings was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. So I devoured that, and I noticed that it was published by this place called Mises Institute, and I found them on the internet and realized that they had an annual event called Mises University. So in 2009, I went to the Mises University, and while I was sitting in Roger Garrison's Austrian Business Cycle Theory lecture, I had this like epiphany moment. I had this like moment where I was like, yes, this is what I want to, because I wasn't even an econ major when I was an undergraduate. I was actually a psychology and a comm major, which might explain why I'm interested in this personality and psychology stuff. But the rest is history. So then I decided I wanted to study at Auburn because of its proximity to the Mises Institute. So I was able to go to all the events, and I did the summer fellowships and worked on my dissertation during the summer at the Mises Institute. I was able to take graduate classes with Salerno and Mark Thornton. And it was a great experience. And the way I got to Bryan College, I think you asked me that as well. The way I got there is Tim Terrell knew the academic VP at Bryan College, and they had an opening here, and so he sent it along to me. And it was actually like really short notice. Like I heard about it in June, I think, and the position was going to start in August for the fall semester of 2017. And it was exactly the sort of position that I was looking for, which is a small, private, Christian, liberal arts type school, and it was in the South. I don't really want to move where it's cold, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. So that's how I got to be where I am now.
Next question here comes from the Fox, and he asks, where do you see crypto and digital currencies heading into the future?
Man, I don't know. I like cryptocurrencies a lot. I can't. I'm not one to make any prediction, however. So I think you probably want some sort of like price prediction or something like that. But I just don't know. I'm not currently heavily invested in any cryptocurrency. I accidentally timed the market right. I sold some. Please don't tell on me to the Bitcoin people. I sold some of my Bitcoin around Christmas time last year just to have some extra cash to buy Christmas gifts, and that turned out to be pretty good timing because ever since then the price has been coming down. So I don't know. I really like the idea. I really like branching out and away from fractional reserve banking and from fiat money. It'd be really nice for us to have a way to do business away from the central bank and away from the banking system. But as for like personal predictions, I don't have any.
Next question here, excuse me, comes from Lacaro, and he asked, how can we reach a higher proximity of laissez-faire capitalism in general whenever we're so deep inside the powers of state and global organizations?
I was thinking about that today. That's a great question. So I'll rephrase that question: Is should we be black pilled or should we be white pilled? And I I I sort of bounce between the two. It sort of just depends on what news is happening at the time. But there's so many good things happening right now. Like school choice is has branched off, and like basically Republicans are that's a litmus test for Republicans now. And so I think that's a good sign. The cryptocurrencies are becoming household terms, so that's good that people are talking about currencies that are away from the Fed and other central banks. There's all sorts of good things that happen. I think there's a ton of distrust of the media these days, which is good, way more than in the past. So those are good things, and obviously there's a bunch of bad things going on as well. I try not to get I try not to get myself like totally wound up in the current thing, whether it's good or bad. I try to focus on me and my community and taking care of my family. I think that that's the better way to go about things as opposed to being wrapped up in what's going on all around the world. I don't think we're meant to know everything that's going on all around the world. And I think social media and Twitter and stuff like that has really warped our minds into thinking that we need to get totally outraged about something that's happening, you know, thousands of miles away from us, or we need to be like really happy about something that's happening thousands of miles away from us. I think it's better, at least for me, it's better for me to just think about my own life and my own family and my own community.
Next question here comes from Dabchick, and he asks, is there a possibility of ever going back to sound money, e.g. a gold standard, or will there have to be a displacement of the existing money?
Yeah, I think it would have to be a displacement. I think, I mean, at least I don't really know of any other like good examples of like a nice and easy transition. Usually, what happens is money loses its value, and people decrease their demand for the currency to the point where like you can't use it to make purchases, and so people just sort of naturally find some sort of alternative money to deal with. Uh, yeah, of course I can't make like any hard predictions once again, but it seems like the tendency for fiat monies is they they blow up and it's a big chaotic situation. It's not a nice easy transition from one money to the next.
Next question here comes from Kaleidic Virtue, and they asked, do you think this idea of personality can be more foundational to thymology, and maybe more insight into the Austrian inquiries into the concept of institutions?
Say that last part about institutions again.
And maybe more insight into the Austrian inquiries of the concept of institutions.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. But I think what Salerno does in this article that I talked about tonight, I think he's doing something similar, or or yeah, he is doing thymology. He is doing like economic history in a way. Well, actually, it is. It's not even in a way. It's economic history. So I think we can do we can have an Austrian approach to personality that doesn't involve like forsaking or compromising on like the a priori nature of like the laws of economics. And it's simply because like we know what it's like to be human. So a lot of the way we derive a lot of the first few laws of economics is like we just understand like that we live in a universe that's marked by scarcity. So like we know what it means to be a human in this environment, in this universe. Like we have a conception of time, we have a conception of cause and effect, and these sorts of things are necessary for action. And so then we build the edifice of economic theory based on those basic insights of cause and effect. There's a funny back and forth paper. My friends Tate Fegley and Carl Friedrich Israel wrote a paper about the disutility of labor and whether we should consider it as an assumption when we're constructing economic theory, or if we can just say it's true by definition that labor has disutility. And then there's a reply by Salerno. Salerno does not like that idea. He totally smashes them. I think they have like there's something to their idea. Like at some point we can just like we don't have to say everything is a priori or just like a flimsy assumption. But Salerno, he came. What's interesting, the reason I'm bringing it up is because he came up with a bunch of different uh, possible universes in which labor does not have uh, a a leisure opportunity cost, if I'm remembering correctly. Basically, that a universe in which people don't necessarily have disutility for their labor, and what sort of economics would exist in those sorts of universes. And some of them are quite crazy. Like one of them involves like one mind controlling two bodies or multiple bodies, and you can just duplicate bodies at will. Like you don't have scarce bodies, but like one mind can control multiple bodies, and like what sort of economics would exist in that case, in which basically human labor is completely like super abundant, and so the marginal utility would go to zero, and all these other sorts of weird things would happen as a result. Anyway, I can't even remember how I came to that, but since we are humans and we exist in a division of labor, then we can talk in general terms about what it means to exist in that sort of environment, and also what happens when we lose the ability to engage in economic calculation. What happens when we lose the ability to participate in a division of labor? What are some of like the psychological consequences of that? I think Salerno does that in his article, and I think it's worthwhile to do that, namely because it's another arrow in our quiver. So like if we don't like hyperinflation because of all the economic effects, but it seems like we're losing that battle intellectually because we still have a bunch of inflation going on. And so we might as well, talk about the psychological effects because it's not just material effects of hyperinflation. There's also all these spiritual and psychological effects as well.
We'll end off on one last question here from Castor Troy. And he asks, do you think Jordan Peterson's work provides interdisciplinary robustness to understanding human action more broadly? For example, this work on value judgments and hierarchy being necessary in perception and doing science. And if so, how can we expand on it?
Yes. The answer is yes. I think he's onto something with his action framework, and not just because it's close to Mises and close to Rothbard's conception of action, but I think it just makes sense. It seems to accord with my own experience in the way that I encounter and act within the world. So the second question, for example, his work on value judgments and hierarchy being necessary in perception and in doing science, how can we expand on it? I think like Salerno's article expands on that, and and if the thing that I'm doing turns into something, then it would be expanding on that. Um, I do think on the same idea that we should be more careful in our writing as Austrian economists, uh, talking about ends. And the reason why is because things things get really fuzzy when we have multiple goals for the same action. And that's why I think it's best to consider action as not attaining an end. I mean, unless we define end in a certain way, it's best to conceive of action as using means to attain a desired state of affairs, or a desired universe. And the reason why I say it that way is because when we're acting, we're choosing a universe that is situated in such a way or arranged in such a way where we are better off than the alternative where we didn't act or if we acted in a different way. And that includes a bunch of stuff. That's not like what the mainstream economists talk about, like with utils and like units of satisfaction. So a lot of times, when I read or hear Austrian economists talking about attaining ends, or want satisfaction, it has that same sort of idea of like psychologically we get like this little plus one, this little ding, these points that we get by consuming a bundle of goods that we like. But it's more appropriate, like the way that we actually act is not that. It's like what Castro Troy mentioned there. We have a hierarchy of values. We have a bunch of nested ends that we're trying to attain whenever we act, and all or some of those, or maybe none of those, if we totally fail in our action, would be achieved or attained in that state of affairs. So it's like the Peterson's example with the fork. So like, not only did I place the fork in the correct location, so like the physical action has a goal, but also like I'm trying to be a good person, I'm trying to be a good family member, I want to have a nice meal with my family, blah 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 blah. Like we actually need this tool so that we can consume, so we can move the food from the plate to our mouths, and so on and so forth. So like all of those goals can be articulated as a part of the state of affairs that's actually that the actor tries to attain. Um, and if we just talk about ends and want satisfaction, then we sort of miss out on the fact that our actions are much more complex. They're usually much more complex than that, than just like trying to get a few little utility points.
All right, with that being said, thank you very much, Dr. Newman, for coming on to speak with us tonight. I think I speak for everyone whenever I say a lot of really interesting stuff you presented tonight and learned a lot. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. In the way of closing announcements, I think the only thing I have is that next week, so a week from today, which will be July